and welcome to the next edition of Reclaiming My Mind. I am your host, Jessica Vaughn, also the president of the Democratic Progressive Caucus of Tampa Bay. And today we have with us our next mayoral candidate, City of Tampa mayoral candidate, Harry Cohen. Thank you for joining us, Harry.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be with you.
I'm super excited that so many of the mayoral candidates are coming on and we're getting a chance to hear from them, because for local politics, there's not a huge amount of ways to get in touch with the candidates unless you have the time to go to the forum. So we really appreciate when candidates come on and make themselves available. So what I generally like to do, especially since I think this is the first time you and I have formally met.
I think it is.
Before we jump into any of the platform issues or your candidacy, I like to know a little bit about our guests. So tell me about your background, how long you've been in Tampa, what you do for a living, and let's find out a little bit about Harry the man.
Well, I was born in Tampa, and I was born at St. Joseph's Hospital. Oh. My mother was in her final year at USF at the time. She had met my father at Gainesville when he was at the University of Florida. And like many people, they got divorced when I was a little kid. And I split my time between Tampa, where my father lived, and Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where my mother lived and where I spent some of my growing up years. I, after school, and I went to law school and became a lawyer, came back to Tampa in 1998. I was 28 years old, and I went to work for a very prominent, famous criminal defense lawyer named Harry Cohen, who is not related to me, but at the time was taking on a very famous case involving a missing baby, the Sabrina Eisenberg case. And that was sort of my first job as a lawyer. And in 2004, when Pat Frank was elected clerk of the circuit court in Hillsborough County, she asked me to come on board with her and become her chief deputy. And I had worked on her campaign. I had gotten involved in Democratic politics. And I ended up going to work at the courthouse. And I spent the next decade of my life, prior to being elected to city council, taking the courthouse from the court system, from an entirely paper-based system where all of the documents were filed in paper and we used file folders, to a system where people e-file into a state portal and a centralized portal. And now all of the documents, all of the work of the courts are done digitally and are done electronically. And it has reduced the staff of that office. It's about 2/3 of what it was when we started in 2005. Their budget got cut a lot, so this was really right in the nick of time, because without these efficiencies, I think the office would have suffered. But a lot of things are really easy to do now if you deal with the clerk's office. Sure. And it's made it a lot more accessible for the public to be able to get information, to be able to actually access the courts, and be able to do it, a lot of self-help that wasn't available before. I was elected to city council in 2011, representing the South Tampa seat, and reelected in 2015. And if you want, I can talk a little bit about what I've done on council.
Yeah, that was some of the next questions. So, I mean, you can go off the cuff, but my next question was kind of, what do you feel like were your biggest achievements, or what you accomplished while you were on city council, or what you're really proud of, the legacy you're kind of going to leave behind?
Well, the thing that I'm probably the most proud of, there's a few things, but the biggest thing that I championed during my time on council was a major stormwater and flooding initiative to finally deal with what happens in Tampa when we have a major afternoon rain at 4:00 in the afternoon in August, and you're on your way to Publix and get marooned on the side of the road because there's 20 feet of water flooding out major arteries.
Especially in South Tampa, which you said was your district, right?
Yes, that's correct. But I will tell you that it really is a citywide problem. So we are spending $250 million in the city over the next 30 years, but probably most of the work will be done in 10, to do major capital improvements to our stormwater and flooding infrastructure throughout the city. We have 5 major projects, like 100 more minor projects that are strewn throughout different neighborhoods. And we also like tripled the amount of money that we're spending to maintain our system, to get debris out of the system, to make sure that the water flows more smoothly. I want to be very clear with people that this is not enough in terms of dealing with rising tides and the rise in the water table. This is something that's going to help us in terms of what we deal with on a routine basis, but it's not the answer for the kinds of major storm surge and flooding that we could expect during a hurricane. And it's not the answer for global warming and sea level rise. It is a Band-Aid to get us to finding those answers. And that's something we can talk about today because I feel very strongly about it. Another thing that I did on city council that I'm very, very proud of is I introduced the ordinance to decriminalize possession of marijuana in the city of Tampa. We became the first major city in Tampa to do that. There are at least 2,500 people out there that receive the equivalent of a parking ticket as opposed to a trip through the criminal justice system because of marijuana possession. I think it's a great, great thing that we did. We are keeping people employed and in school instead of in the criminal justice system. There are a lot of other things too. I was the father of the backyard chicken ordinance. I don't have any chickens myself, but there are a lot of people that wanted the opportunity to have chickens. I am a major proponent of swimming pools, and I fought for the renovation of 3 pools in the city of Tampa that are now open to the public, heated, have lots of activity at them, really, really popular, both on Davis Island and in my South Tampa district, and in East Tampa at Williams Park and at Cascaden Pool. And then just a lot of other sort of more minor things in different neighborhoods that we've done. It could be a traffic light. It could be getting LED lights outside of a school. Just when you're on city council, every sidewalk that you build, every traffic light that you get signalization right, every place that you can deal with ameliorating the flooding, every place that you can build a new fire station. We've built a lot of new fire stations in the last 8 years. These are things that really add to people's quality of life. We also banned the use of nitrate enriched fertilizers during the rainy season in the city of Tampa. I am convinced, based on the latest report about the red tide, that our doing that prevented the red tide scourge in Tampa Bay that we saw up and down the coast. And a lot of things to work to save the tree canopy. That's a big issue on city council, something we've spent a lot of time on. So lots of different things throughout the city.
Nice. So what would you say were some of the biggest challenges that you faced as a city council member?
Well, the biggest challenge I think that all of us have faced, there have been 2 things. The first is that because of the Great Recession that preceded my term on council, the city's tax base, because of Save Our Homes, the tax base recovers much more slowly than property values do once things start to turn around. And as a result, every single year that I've been on council, the budget has been a big challenge, having enough money to fund city services. We've put a lot more money into after-school programs. We have tried to invest and have invested in a lot of parks, particularly in our urban core. But at the end of the day, money has been tight, and it's going to continue to be tight, and that's always a challenge. I am the chairman of the City Council Finance Committee, and I'm very proud of the fact that even through all these years where we have dealt with these really tight budgets, we've had 13 ratings increases over that period, and that's very significant for the taxpayers because it means that the city is paying the lowest possible interest rates on money that it borrows. And if we lose the benefit of that bond rating, it's really a tax increase because it means your money is going to go for less. You're just going to be paying more in interest. Right.
Yeah, I'm on my CDD board and we're always having to figure out the best way to invest our money to get the biggest bang for it.
I was just going to say the other big challenge has been growth and congestion and the fact that there are, by some estimates, 150 people a day moving into the region, 500,000 coming in the next 20 years, maybe more. And I think that the Trump tax bill is only going to exacerbate that because he has, with this tax bill, penalized states like New Jersey and Illinois and states that had basically were spending more on schools and infrastructure. They're being penalized, and people are coming here, I think, at an even more aggressive rate.
So that leads me to talk about transportation, right? Which is at the forefront of almost every city candidate's campaign. So it's obviously a crisis we have facing here in Tampa. I think regardless of what neighborhood you live in, you spend a lot of your time in frustration, feeling, frustrated that you're trapped in your car. Now, you were on the MPO board.
I am
is that
on
right?
the MPO.
You're on the MPO board, which manages transportation.
It manages transportation planning. And the big frustration on that board, I've been on it for 8 years.
Yeah.
The big frustration is that we've been putting together a lot of plans and we've never had any money.
Right.
The All for Transportation initiative has completely changed our focus in terms of what it is now going to be possible.
And for people who aren't familiar with just the name of it, that's the sales tax that we passed back in the midterms to fund transportation.
That's right. And it'll be a 1 cent sales tax for 30 years. So it's a really, really big investment that the community has decided to make in transportation and transit.
So tell us, now that you've been planning for so long in transportation, and now that you think we're going to have a lot more funding, as mayor, what your vision it would be for transportation in Tampa.
Well, I think that first of all, you have to define what are the problems that you're trying to solve in building out a transportation system. And there are a couple that I would sort of put at the forefront of where I think our attention needs to go. The first is safety. We, in this state, through the great wisdom of our legislature, if you live within 2 miles of a school, you are not eligible to take the bus. You have to walk. And in many cases in Tampa, that means you are walking on inadequate sidewalks, maybe non-existent sidewalks, places where there are not crosswalks, not proper lighting, not proper infrastructure to make the walk safe. I feel like this is an absolute disgrace and is at the absolute very top of the list of the things that I think this money should address. We are number 1 in the nation. We alternate with Orlando for being the most dangerous cities in America for bicycles and pedestrians.
Yeah.
And we have to do better. The second thing I think is congestion, just the fact that there are too many cars on the road.
Right.
So we have to give people alternatives. It's particularly a problem. It's a huge problem in New Tampa. It's becoming a bigger problem in South Tampa. But in downtown, if you have a hockey game, a convention, and something at the Performing Arts Center going on at the same time, it's complete gridlock. And we are just simply not going to be able to develop as a city unless we figure out a way to move people around.
Right.
So I have a 4-page transportation plan. It is on my website, harry2019.com. Talks a lot about safety. The biggest thing that it talks about to deal with the congestion issue is the building of a downtown central station that will allow a Bright Line train from Orlando, a new and improved and expanded and reliable upgraded streetcar that goes up through downtown and is extended into Tampa Heights.
That's as far as it goes, not Seminole Heights?
It could go all the way up to Seminole Heights, but the first leg would be to take it from basically the foot of the Fort Brooke Garage past the Performing Arts Center and up into Tampa Heights.
Gotcha.
Then also a place where anything that we were to do on the CSX tracks, either going north toward USF and New Tampa from downtown or south into the peninsula toward MacDill Air Force Base, all of these things could intersect together in one station. And that gives people the option of getting to the urban core and then getting around the urban core without the need for a car.
Right.
And then I would say the third piece of it really has to do with affordable housing, because right now so many people are commuting into the urban core because they can't afford to live in the urban core.
Sure.
We need to provide opportunities for people to live near where they work. That will help with our transportation infrastructure needs, but it will also tremendously improve people's quality of life because they won't have to spend as much time and valuable time, family time. Commuting. And it's also very expensive to commute. So instead of having your disposable income consumed by a commute, you could actually afford to live in the city itself.
So would you say that you are a proponent of using the tracks, the existing CRS tracks?
CSX, absolutely. For some type of a commuter rail program, but I'll tell you what else I want to use it for. There is a lot of right-of-way, particularly owned between CSX and the Expressway Authority, that I think lends itself to a pedestrian bicycle trail that could literally bisect the entire city of Tampa on right-of-way that already exists and help us deal with the conflict that exists between bicycles and cars. It would be wonderful to have bicycles and pedestrians have the choice of a segregated path that segregated from cars that could move you throughout the city.
Right. So one of the things that I've seen between two of the mayoral candidates that is different is the discussion about whether using those tracks or building a light rail would be more expensive. One candidate seems to think those tracks are, we would just leasing them would be astronomical and unrealistic, whereas another candidate thinks that light rail, the price is just way more expensive. What's your opinion regarding that?
Well, first of all, I think that the issue of how expensive the CSX tracks would be has changed because there's not that much use of them anymore. I know that on the South Tampa route, for example, there's just a couple of trains a week. One of them goes to a chemical formulating plant that's right in the middle of residential development that probably needs to move for other reasons. So, in fact, I think that the value of those tracks to CSX might be less than it was in the past when it looked like it was just going to be astronomical.
Right.
I don't believe that light rail is the answer for a region-wide or citywide system. I think it's too flimsy. I think you need a real train. If you take the what is essentially a light rail line from the airport to the rental car center.
Right.
It's fine for a short trip. I don't know if that type of technology would work for the kinds of commuting distances that we're talking about.
Gotcha. And then I was just curious myself, since you were on the MPO, I know that and had several friends who were very involved with the TBX and they were trying to expand the interstate and add the toll lanes. And so many of my friends would, go and lobby against that. Where was your stance during kind of the debate during TBX?
Well, I'll tell you, I voted for it. And I will tell you why, and I'll tell you what I was expecting to happen and what didn't happen. I agree, first of all, with the fact that the DOT plan for express lanes from downtown north on 275 was terrible. I said from the very beginning I wanted it out. And I made it very clear to the people that were opposed to TBX that I would fight to get that out. And in fact, it did come out even before the whole thing collapsed. But the reason that I voted for it and was because there were about $9 billion worth of other things that were included in it, one of which was the very, very critical issue of rebuilding the interchange where the Howard Franklin Bridge, 275, and State Road 60 come together. As many people are aware, when you are coming from St. Pete to Tampa on the Howard Franklin Bridge, 4 lanes bottleneck into 2. And it's a real problem. So I felt that you couldn't sacrifice all the rest of what was in there, that it would be better to get rid piecemeal of the objectionable parts.
Right. And
what happened was ultimately I worked with DOT to get rid of the express lanes. The night of the vote, I said to the anti-TBX people, I'm on your side about this and I'm going to help you derail this part of it. And we did.
Right.
But in fact, when the whole thing collapsed, we also lost the money for what I was so concerned about. And now we still need to do this project at the foot of the Howard Franklin Bridge, and Orlando got our $700 million.
Gotcha.
So that's why I felt the way I did. The other thing was, and I was wrong about this. I mean, you got to say where you were right and say where you were wrong. I felt that because none of the construction was going to start until we got a new governor, that we should try to still bank as much money as we could for expressway improvements, on the assumption that there was at least a good chance that we'd get a Democratic governor and be able to use the money for transportation projects with a totally different prism of what the priorities were. I was wrong about that. But TBX had collapsed long before the gubernatorial election, so it really never came to that.
So in retrospect, are you glad it collapsed?
Well, I certainly am glad that the parts of it that were objectionable collapsed, because there's no question that regardless of what they call it now, Tampa Bay Next, or what ultimately happens, the plan for express lanes and expressway expansion inside the Tampa urban core going north from downtown is dead. So I'm glad that that's dead.
Right.
I'm not glad that we lost the money from the interchange.
Sure.
I also will tell you that, the Howard Franklin Bridge needs to be rebuilt in the next couple of years. And that money is going to flow outside of this TBX package. But I am very concerned about that. I want to make sure not only that it's built out for transit, which is in the plan, and that there's a pedestrian crossing, which is in the plan, but I want to make sure that it actually looks like something other than a concrete slab across the bay. I want it to be an iconic structure that's something that can be a symbol of our region and look, think of the Golden Gate Bridge and the George Washington Bridge and what they look like, the Sunshine Skyway. We can do better than just a nondescript, slab.
Right. All right. So what I'm going to do now is go to some listener questions.
Sure.
Everyone that I know who is kind of shifted their focus from the TBX focus right now is very concerned about the Rays Stadium, especially public funding for the Rays Stadium. And there was word that obviously that wasn't an issue anymore because the owners decided that they were going to invest somewhere else. So it seemed like that was a dead issue. But now you kind of hear whisperings that maybe there are still some county commission members who are in talks and haven't really given up on that idea. So people who were super passionate about TBX are as equally passionate to make sure that we don't have a Rays Stadium in Ybor, and it's definitely not taxpayer funded. Tell me about your stance on that.
Well, let's separate a couple of the issues out. First of all, let me tell you first of all my issue in terms of the city's funding any piece of the stadium.
Okay.
There is no money in the city's general fund budget to put toward the capital cost of a stadium, period. Even if I wanted to find money for it, I am telling you, we do not have the money. It is absolutely, totally irresponsible for anybody to be running for mayor and making a commitment of any dollars toward the construction of a stadium. We just don't have it. So I can tell you that regardless of whether a deal gets done or doesn't get done, for me, that is a line that simply is not going to be crossed. I think that what's happened really more than anything, it's not so much that the deal collapsed. I think that everybody's sort of hit the pause button. And what the Rays, my understanding of, have done is commit to stay at Tropicana Field through 2027, which means they can talk to anybody they want about where to put a stadium anywhere they want and put together any kind of deal they want. It would not surprise me if there was another attempt made, and I think there probably should be another attempt made, to bring the Rays to Tampa. I would love to see the Rays in Tampa. Again, I'm not saying, I'm saying categorically that the city does not have any money for the stadium. But if a deal can be put together among other entities, whether it's the county with the Tourist Development Council, whatever, they're free to do that. I think that ultimately they will look at it, other cities. They will get information about what they might be able to do in Tampa. And I would think, given the size of the media market, that they will take another look at whether or not there's anything in Pinellas. And we'll just have to see where they decide they want to be. I think that the one thing that really argues for them staying here is the size of the TV and broadcast market, which is one of the largest in the country.
In Tampa.
The Tampa Bay media market, the stations like, Channel 8 and 13 that reach, all the way north of Newport Richey, all the way south down to Bradenton and all the way east into Polk County.
Interesting.
That's a really, really big area with a lot of viewers and listeners. Not to mention, if you have a high-speed rail from Orlando, that becomes almost an extension of the market since they don't have a team. So we'll see. We'll see what they decide. Do
you think Ybor would be a good fit regardless of how it's funded?
I really don't know. I will tell you personally, I have never understood why they don't look at the Derby Lane site on the St. Pete side of the Gandy Bridge. To me, Pinellas County has more money available than we do, particularly from their bed tax. That's a very accessible site to Tampa. There's huge infrastructure improvements that have already taken place around it, building out the roads.
Right.
It seems to me to be much closer to the center of the population. I've heard that the site is too low, but they just put all this money into the road on the Pinellas side of the bridge. So it can't be that low, or they wouldn't have
Prioritized it.
Right. So, I think there's just a lot of different moving pieces to this, and we'll just see where it goes. But in terms of Tampa taxpayer money, off the table.
Awesome. So we said you kind of touched on this, and you might have felt like you gave us a sufficient answer, but we did have a listener question, and you said we'd touch more on it, and I said we sure would because we have a listener question. But the question was, tell us more about your policy on mitigating environmental issues in the Tampa Bay area, specifically responding to storm surges. So you talked a little bit about that. How does that roll into the bigger environmental picture of your platform?
Well, let me first say that I believe that the argument about climate change and sea level rise is over.
Interesting.
Well, let me put it another way. I'm no longer interested in engaging in the argument.
Right.
I'm not even getting to the question of what causes sea level rise, but the seas are rising and the water table is rising.
Right.
And Tampa is a very low-lying city. According to a 2015 study, we are the most vulnerable major city to storm surge, ahead of New York, Miami, Houston, and New Orleans.
Interesting.
So
what about Fort Lauderdale?
I don't know about Fort Lauderdale,
Right.
but I know that we were number one, so they must have been lower than
Right.
us. We have MacDill Air Force Base sitting at sea level. We have Tampa General Hospital, our level 1 trauma center, sitting at sea level. A huge amount of our tax base is at sea level. We have Moody's, the bond rating agency, telling municipalities that they are going to start to downgrade their credit rating if they don't see them taking critical steps toward mitigating sea level rise and the rise in the water table. I would argue this is now an economic imperative as well as a social one. I would argue that you will be paying higher taxes to live here if we don't put money into this type of infrastructure. I would also say that 50% of the country's military bases are at sea level. So base closing commissions in the future are going to be looking very closely at what cities are doing to support the infrastructure around these bases.
Right.
All that said, my platform is to get very, very aggressive about mitigating for storm surge and for rise in the water table. I think that it's money well spent, and I think that we can use technology to be our friend, and we can export our expertise to other cities that are coping with the same problems. I think that we can start to take steps on the environmental side as well to reduce our carbon footprint. We can do things like in Israel, they require that all water heaters be solar powered. That's something that we could look at doing here. We can look at putting solar panels into the sidewalks where they can capture energy that's being radiated from the sun. We can do plantings in the water to help suck up some of the additional tidal flooding. We can plant more trees because trees suck up stormwater and groundwater, and it's a great way of holding water. All of it. We need to really get aggressive about this, or we're going to have serious problems.
So while we're talking about environmental issues, part of my concern and what I've been talking about especially as you see, I live on a conservation, is Tampa has so many beautiful areas, that attract people here, whether it's our beaches or some of our beautiful rivers. And as, we run out of room to develop, those areas become, prime real estate for developers. Would you say that as a mayor, you are committed to making sure that those areas and our natural resources are protected from development?
Absolutely, but here's the critical question. Where are you going to put the people? And the answer is you got to build the density in the places that are already urban and already built out, particularly the ones that are going to have access to transit. If you do that,
Right.
you can preserve what's left. If you don't do it, if you don't build the density and you don't get the transportation and infrastructure in place,
Right.
we will continue to sprawl.
And how do you feel like the best plan moving forward to build that kind of thriving urban center is when it comes to specifically housing?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about housing earlier. I think that affordable and attainable housing is probably the crisis of the urban community right now in Tampa. It is becoming increasingly harder for people to live near where they work. And in many cases, people can't afford to live near where they grew up. And the only way that we are going to change this is by becoming much, much more aggressive on a lot of different fronts. And I just want to, throw in the caveat here that the federal government has basically, totally dropped the ball in terms of housing assistance. I mean,
by raiding the fund, right?
During the Obama administration, we got money for affordable housing projects. In most cases now, that money has either been eliminated or reduced, not just reduced a little bit, but like reduced like...
Is that the Sadowski Trust?
Well,
right?
then you have the state, which raids its affordable housing trust fund every year to balance the budget. So the combination of those two things has been devastating.
Right.
And I think that the city has got to take some very bold and creative steps. Number one, we need to take city-owned property that is lying dormant, that we can't even afford to maintain, and get it back on the tax rolls. And that means start partnering with individuals that want to do pilot projects for affordable housing. We've done some RFPs to large builders and large companies to build out multiple lots. I'm talking about working with individuals on things like container homes. Container home land costs are expensive, but shipping containers can be used to build housing at half the cost. It's fabulous product. It's hurricane proof. We ought to try it. Tiny houses, a clump of 4 800 square foot structures around a courtyard in one residential lot. Let's try that. Let's see if that works. Let's make it so that when a developer gets bonus density, affordable housing is right now the list of things you can do to get a bonus density when you're developing multifamily is fairly expansive. We need to narrow it so that affordable housing becomes one of the primary options that developers choose.
That's my favorite thing you've said so far.
So there's a lot of different things that we can do to make housing more affordable. And I think back to FDR at the beginning of the Great Depression. His program for dealing with the economic slowdown was to try all sorts of different things. And some of the things would work and some of the things wouldn't. If it didn't work, they would move on.
Sure.
If it did work, they would expand it. We need to do the same thing with housing.
All right. So now I'm going to kind of switch a little bit and just talk about some of the issues that, as a progressive, especially the president of the Progressive Caucus, is important to me and kind of get your feel for these issues. Like I said, sometimes they might fall under the scope of being mayor or on city council, or they might not, but that's flexible. So for me, I'm a certified teacher. I sub, but education is super important to me. And I'm very concerned about charter schools, the push to privatize education, and we've seen a lot of candidates have a hard time committing to public education. Specifically, when I asked them about that, of whether or not we should be prioritizing our funds and our money towards that. Now, again, that's a legislative, especially in the Florida legislative, that's more of a legislative question. But in general, what would you say is your commitment to public education and your opinion of the charter privatization movement?
I think that communities that do not invest in their schools and do not have a strong public school system ultimately destroy themselves and completely undermine their economic development messages. As far as I am concerned, when you are recruiting corporations or families or small businesses to come to this region, to bring their businesses, to bring their employees, to bring their families, if we do not have a strong public school system, if our schools are underfunded, they're not going to come. Period. Not if they're intelligent, they're not. I feel the same way about the arts. I think if you don't invest in the arts and culture, you have the same type of problem attracting people, because a community that doesn't invest in the arts has no soul.
Right.
And I would say the same thing about education. I think the fact that we passed this half-cent sales tax in Hillsborough County to assist, and by the way, it's a state responsibility, but the fact that our community stepped up, I think, says volumes about where people here place their priority.
Right.
That's an appropriate place to put a priority.
Right.
And I will tell you, I campaigned as hard for the education half cent as I did for the transportation full cent, because I felt that if that failed, we were sending a message to the world that we don't care about our kids. In terms of the charter school issue, I do not approve of the way the legislature has handled charter schools. And I think that undermining the public education system in this country is a very, very bad thing.
All right. Thank you. So I'm assuming that you're going to have an opinion about this, but I just want to touch base because you never know. I was surprised by one of the last candidate's answers. Would you say you're a proponent for LGBTA rights?
Yes.
Okay. Usually it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, I've voted for every initiative we did a domestic partnership registry in the city of Tampa before there was same-sex marriage and marriage equality. And I voted to ban conversion therapy.
Oh, okay. That's good. What about $15 an hour? I've been also surprised by some of the answers of people coming on. And again, I know this is something that we don't control, right? Although Levine did pass something, token in his area, in his city, to kind of help boost the movement of the fight for 15. What do you feel as far as raising minimum wage? And do you think that $15 an hour should be the very lowest of the baseline that we should shoot for when we're talking about raising minimum wage?
So this is a really difficult question. It's a really difficult question because on the one hand, I believe that anybody that works an honest day ought to make a living wage. I think it is a tragedy if a person puts their heart and soul into their work and can't pay their bills. We looked at raising the minimum wage for everything in the city of Tampa to $15. And I must tell you that it was a budget buster. It was just too expensive for the city to be able to consider doing it. And I think that where we came out that we were going to try to move toward it as quickly as we could and make a conscientious effort. So I think the balance between those two things is a really tough one. And, you hear the arguments that going to a $15 minimum wage will actually cause people to lose jobs. I'm not necessarily going to buy that one. But I will tell you that when we looked at the impact on the city's budget of doing something like this, it was not something that we saw a way to be able to afford.
Interesting. So the next question that I was surprised that I didn't get a lot of response to, but I think you'll have a clear response based on what I saw last night, is adult use marijuana, whether or not that should be legal in the state of Florida. And I'm very clear not to say recreational because activists have been clear in the language to say that it's adult use. But you made I love
that, the adult use label. I think that's a great way of describing it. I am very strongly on record as being in favor of adult use marijuana. I really wish the state would legalize it and tax it, quite frankly. Right. I would love to see the pool of money that could be brought in from that used to pay more money for teachers, for example, or more money for first responders. Part of the way that you could solve the affordable housing crisis for teachers and first responders would be to pay them more. And here's a source of revenue to do it. Right. I will tell you that on city council, I was the parent of the ordinance to decriminalize possession of marijuana and make it into what is the equivalent of a parking ticket as opposed to a criminal offense. It is something that I think I told you earlier that I'm very proud of. And I will use the bully pulpit of the mayor's office to advocate for reform of marijuana laws in the state of Florida. Absolutely.
I think that's a good choice. Because when we had our meetings, the Progressive Caucus, the largest meeting we ever had that got sides from all of the partisans was our medical marijuana and adult use marijuana. It seems like it's definitely the issue, cross partisanship, that resonates on both sides of the.
Well, people have had, first of all, people have had a lot of different issues with experiences with this at different stages in their life.
Sure.
And if you've ever been close to someone who's been sick with cancer or had a terminal illness and determined that marijuana was the only thing that could relieve their suffering, and then come to face the moral dilemma of how to handle that given the law.
Right.
That's just there's too many people that have been through that.
Right. What about Medicare for all? Tell me what you think about the push, especially from the Democratic Party now, to kind of embrace that concept.
You know, I'm not an expert on healthcare policy. I don't know a lot about it, but I will say this. It seems to me that the beginning of that would be to lower the Medicare age eligibility to 55 and to start with pushing the age back. And maybe you could just keep pushing it back and eventually capture everyone into the system. I don't really know.
Right.
But I certainly, am supportive of anything that will get control of healthcare costs in this country. Because I can tell you, for the city of Tampa, for our budget, healthcare costs for employees and retirees is a major, major issue, because not only is it a major strain on the city's budget, but, our plans basically cover less and less every year, in the sense that copays go up, deductibles go up, and it becomes too expensive for people to get sick. They don't go to the doctor because the cost of the visit, after you deal with all the administrative charges, ends up being unaffordable. And that is not a good thing. That is exactly what you don't want. People letting things go and not getting the medical care that they need on the front end.
And even if they can afford the care, they usually can't afford the prescriptions after the doctor.
That's another piece of it.
So would you say you think healthcare is a human right?
I think healthcare is a human right. I do. Yeah. I mean, I let me say it this way. When somebody shows up in an emergency room and they've cut off their finger in the lawnmower, I believe that it is their absolute right to get that finger dealt with. I mean, to get it treated.
Right.
So I suppose that I would say yes.
Okay. Speaking of rights, one thing I like to touch on is worker rights and unions. Where do you see workers' rights? It looks like across the country there's even more of an aggressive attack on unions and workers' rights. Where do you prioritize that as far as where you stand on the issues, workers' rights and unions?
Well, the city has the police and fire unions, and it also has the general employees union. And I think they do a good job of representing the workers of the city. I think they perform a needed function. I think that it's very important for the mayor to have an open dialogue with those groups and not view them as adversaries, but view them as partners. Because at the end of the day, they are representing the human capital of the city.
Right.
And, I don't see that. I don't see what's going on in the city changing anytime soon in terms of who's unionized and who's not.
What about gun reform? Tell me your thoughts on gun reform.
Oh, I'm definitely in favor of gun reform. I think that what's happened in this country is a terrible tragedy, and I am. Let me say first off, I am. Everyone, I think, qualifies it by saying, I don't want to go after guns that belong to hunters. And I don't want to take away people's rights to defend themselves in their own homes.
Sure.
But the ready access to semi-assault and assault-style weapons by people that clearly have some sort of mental imbalance. The idea that that you're on the no-fly list and you can purchase those types of firearms, those types of bump stocks. I think it's just absolutely outside of what the Second Amendment ever contemplated. And I wish that we would have some common sense gun reform in this country. I think it is, we just lurch from one incident to another. And it's a very, very sad thing.
Absolutely. What about, I know we can't become a sanctuary city, right? That's been explained to me because we don't have that rights of the sheriff.
Right.
But if that was a possibility, so if people get an idea for how you feel on immigration, if that was an option, if we were set up differently, do you think that you would be a mayor who would be a proponent of becoming a sanctuary city?
I don't know. I will say this, because it's not an option. It's not
Right.
something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. But I would say this. I think that there are much higher and better uses for our police department, which is a limited resource, than to have them going around enforcing immigration law. I think that in fact we have plenty of other things for them to do, particularly related to what we were talking about earlier with bicycle and pedestrian safety, with traffic, with congestion, and with crime, and with real legitimate crimes that need to be solved. That I don't see adding that to their list of responsibilities as being particularly helpful.
Right. So now that we're kind of talking about criminal justice in general, giving your thoughts on criminal justice reform or racial justice in general, I've seen you, out in a lot of the marginalized communities. It seems like you're being very reflective in a lot of those communities. How is that shaping kind of your platform when we're talking about racial justice? Because criminal reform and criminal justice is a huge part of racial justice.
So I think that I was the first person that I'm aware of that actually called for a special session of the legislature to deal with Stand Your Ground during one of the many incidents that we had over the past year where that came up. And you know what? I don't even, this is how horrible it is. I don't remember which incident it was in response to that I said that, because there are so many different things going on at any given time.
I think it was Marquise McLaughlin.
I think it was.
Right?
I think it was. The Clearwater case. I think it was. But look, one of the reasons, and I said this at the time, that I introduced the marijuana decriminalization ordinance was because the laws are applied differently to people of color and people with less means than they are to other people. I mean, how this is dealt with in one part of the city is not necessarily always been the way it's been dealt with in another part of the city. And so we have to attack these types of things at the level of changing the laws. And I think that we have seen marijuana is just a great example of it. There's no reason to incarcerate people, keep them from getting gainful employment, keep them from getting an education for this type of a violation. And we need to start looking at everything through the prism of what is it that we are trying to accomplish. I believe very strongly that you set policy at the top, and the tone that you set is very clear to everyone. And in the city of Tampa, where the mayor is strong, and I think that Buckhorn at times has been great in this sense, has been very clear that we are not going to tolerate bigotry and intolerance and hate in our city. And I think that that's a message that constantly has to be hammered home. But the real thing that will change it is economics. Affordable and attainable housing is the thing that will help change the issues between the races, because when people's lives are stable and they can work and make a decent living and live in a place that is affordable for them, quality of life goes up and things just get better.
What do you think about community policing? The concept of encouraging police officers to live in the communities that they serve, so that their relationships, so that their relationships build. Do you think that would be a priority?
I think it definitely works. My city council district includes the Howard Avenue Entertainment District, and we've had a lot of issues there over the last 8 years. And I will tell you that I work very closely with the police related to issues there, as do the business owners, as do the residents, and it makes all the difference. It makes all the difference, because there are so many people around that know who to call when there's a problem and know what to do when there's a problem and feel comfortable doing it. It's made a tremendous difference in the way things operate.
So one of the things that I really liked when Mike Suarez came on was kind of his approach to making sure that he wanted to represent all of the communities and really build relationships with all of the communities. Because you hear a lot of people running for office who pander to different communities at the time, especially marginalized communities, and make promises to win their vote. But then when they're elected, they don't have that same commitment. And since you've been district specific in your term, we haven't really had an opportunity to see, but once you're elected citywide, how do you feel like you would be able to prioritize making sure that all of the communities in the city have the same amount of resources and the same amount of focus and the same amount of access to you as mayor?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there's two different answers to it. The first one is that as a council member, I have been extremely accessible. I am out in the neighborhoods all the time. It is very easy to get an appointment with me. If you have a problem and you call my office and we can't solve it over the phone and you want to meet with me, you come in and meet with me, and you could have that from anywhere in the city. Now, I think it would be unrealistic for a mayor to make that 100% blanket commitment. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you that I am a hands-on kind of person. I will be out in the streets watching the stormwater work get done. I will be looking at the sidewalk construction. I will be inspecting the signals that have been placed to see that things are operating the way they are supposed to be when we are making investments in the community. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that the word that I like to use is equity. Resources need to be divided with equity, with fairness. Not every neighborhood has the same problem. Mm-hmm. Some have flooding, some have crime, some have homelessness, some have sidewalks that are in disrepair, some have just good old-fashioned congestion. You've got to deal with people where they live, mm-hmm. deal with their problem as they have it.
Right.
But it ought to be with equity. The city ought to be apportioning its resources fairly. I will tell you as a city council member mm-hmm. that as a district council member, mm-hmm. I have always had the policy with the other district council members. I will support things in your neighborhood. And I have. I supported a new community. I was the deciding vote on a new community center and a new fire station here in New Tampa. I was the deciding vote on restrooms in Villa Brothers Park in West Tampa. I will support, as long as a district council member, as long as my district was getting its fair share, I want everybody else to get their fair share. Mm. I don't want one part of the city to get more of the pie than another part of the city. I want everybody to get, and the way that you determine what that is when people representing all four quadrants of the city come together and agree and vote on a budget. That tells you that we're moving toward, that we're at something that looks like equity.
Would you say that some neighborhoods have food deserts and food insecurity as one of the crises in many of the neighborhoods within Tampa?
I definitely think that there are parts of Tampa that could use an additional grocery store, an additional opportunity to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. But I will also tell you that my observation has been that, for example, St. Pete is actually much worse than the areas. The areas of Tampa, you have to go far less distance to actually reach a major supermarket or grocery store than in St. Petersburg. I'm not saying it's right.
Sure.
I'm just saying that I don't think that our situation is as critical as it is in some other cities. But bears, it could be improved. Could be improved.
So what has it been like running a race against one of your friends who you've worked on with city council for a while?
Well, actually, Mike Suarez and I are good friends, and we've maintained a cordial relationship through the campaign. We actually have had a few good laughs at City Hall, recounting some of the mayoral forums and some of the things that have gone on. What's interesting is that I, with the exception of Dick Greco, who I don't know well, I've only met him a few times.
Right.
With his exception, I know them all, and I know them all, some of them pretty well. And I really do believe that overall you have a group of people that care very deeply about the city, want to do the right thing,
right,
and are people with their heart in the right place. I think that what's different about us is that we have different skill sets and we have different things that we would emphasize. And for me, the infrastructure emphasis is a constant thing that I come back to, because I really feel that for the next 8 to 10 years, our focus in Tampa must be on infrastructure, both transportation and what I was talking about earlier with stormwater, sea level rise, and the rise in the water table. This is an issue that we need to deal with now. We cannot wait for the next mayor to deal with this. We need to start dealing with it now.
Which you already answered my next question, which is going to be, what do you think sets you apart? And you segued perfectly for me, so I appreciate that.
I am telling people, I want you to vote for me to give me a mandate to put the city government's attention toward these issues.
Right.
We know that we're going to grow a lot in the upcoming years.
Yeah.
We've got to do so in a way that is responsible. We're going to grow. People that say, oh, stop the growth, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So we've got to make sure that as we grow, we do so in a way that is mitigating for what we know is becoming an increasingly big challenge. And that is, again, sea level rise, the rise in the water table, and also the delivery of fresh water. Our freshwater delivery infrastructure is old. It's crumbling. We have water main breaks across the city. We need to completely and totally rebuild it to the tune of about $3 billion over the next 10 to 15 years.
Would you consider yourself progressive?
I would consider myself progressive. Yeah, I would. I think that, I tend to think of myself as being a very moderate, middle of the road kind of person. I'm a Democrat. I have been a registered Democrat for a long time. If you look at my contribution history, you will see that I have spent my life supporting progressive and Democratic candidates. But as I look at myself in terms of the issues, I realize that the progressive label actually does fit me very well, because on every issue that is important to progressives, I have a stance that puts me squarely on their side.
Are you
on our side?
Are you going to seek the Progressive Caucus endorsement?
I am.
Okay.
I am.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, would you say, and
I'm also strongly pro-choice and have been a big Planned Parenthood supporter for many, many years. As a matter of fact, about 2 years ago, I gave the main ask at their lunch.
That's good to know. I need to put that on my list of issues. I can't believe it fell off.
Very, very important issue not to be forgotten about, particularly given the state of the Supreme Court. This is not a settled question in this country.
Even stuff that's being proposed at state legislation in Florida.
That's right.
One of the issues that I have been asking people about that I've got a surprising answer to is, as we're talking about the legislation, there's so much happening where people are proposing kind of mandated Bible study or, things educationally that might cross the line of the division between church and state.
I'm against that.
Okay. I just like to ask that because a lot of people don't, and you'd be surprised how many candidates seem really progressive up till you get to that point, and then all of a sudden they talk about creationalism or they think it's okay to mandate. I mean, religious study is fine, but pushing one religion over the other.
Yeah, I'm not for pushing one religion over the other.
A contrast that I've seen between some of the candidates are one candidate might be super policy driven, which is awesome. And then another candidate might be a little less policy driven, but more reflective because they really want to kind of engage their constituency. And before they feel like they have strong policies, they want to feel like they've really reflected what their constituency want. Would you say if you had to choose, if you were more policy driven or more reflective, what would be your answer?
I think the best thing about my candidacy is that I'm both. I think that I have the advantage of having spent 8 years listening at city council meetings to people from all over the city. You can represent a district, but you vote on things all over the city and you listen to people all over the city. And I am firmly convinced that the things that I am talking about in this campaign are the things that the people of Tampa care about. I believe that I am very policy driven. I am very detail driven, but I believe that it is based on knowing what people want done. Flooding, transportation, and affordable housing come up constantly in all parts of the city in one way or another.
Right.
There's another component of my campaign that we didn't talk about today, and that's civility. And that's the idea of civility in politics. And I would just say that I think that the quality of our conversations about public policy in this country at the federal level and to some degree at the state level too are a disgrace. And we should not be exposing ourselves or our children to this kind of an atmosphere. And I hope that in the city of Tampa, we can respect each other. We can disagree without being disagreeable. We can not demonize one another when our ideas are different.
Right.
But we can have the kind of discussions that are worthy of the people of our city. And that's why I've really tried hard in this race to be generous toward my opponents, say nice things about them when I can, because look, there are some things I disagree with some of them about strongly, but I want to make sure that we do it in the context of being respectful of one another and respectful of the people that we're asking to vote for us.
What inspired you to want to run for mayor?
I'd love to tell you that this has been my lifelong ambition. That's really not true. I always did want to run for office at some point, and running for city council 8 years ago was very much the culmination of that. But deciding to run for mayor is a very, very big decision.
Right.
It's a big personal commitment. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, obviously.
I would imagine.
But I truly believe that at this point in the city, I am the best candidate. I actually feel that given the things that are challenging this community, giving the skill sets that are going to be required, giving the ability to work with others and compromise that is going to be needed, I think that I have the ability to do it. And I love the city of Tampa. I'm a native, and I want to see good things happen for our community and for the many wonderful people that live here. And I think that we are on the cusp of really great things in Tampa, and I would love to see us continue the progress and be the city that we've always wanted to be. I see it happening downtown. I see it happening in Ybor City. I see it happening on the waterfront and in the neighborhoods and in the parks and in the pools and in all the great public spaces that we've created. And I think it's a really exciting time.
Okay, so in closing, what I'm curious about, was there anything that you want to share that we haven't covered thus far, or anything you want to talk about in regards to your campaign that we haven't mentioned?
So I should tell you that you can reach me at harry2019.com. Our campaign is located at 4300 East 7th Avenue in Tampa. And anyone that is interested in becoming involved, please get in touch with me. You can reach me by email at harry2019.com. We're always looking for volunteers and people to help us put out literature. We're obviously also looking for donations. That's very, very important.
Absolutely.
When you're running in a citywide race.
Right.
So you can also contribute there. You can also find my built out transportation plan on that website. And again, it's harry2019.com. And I appreciate anybody giving me favorable consideration and voting for me for mayor of Tampa on March 5th, 2019.
And that's what I was going to say. So the election is on March 5th. How about social media? Are you active on social media?
We're very active on Facebook. And you can see I put out a marijuana legalization video this week that's on Facebook right now. It's a nice piece, I think, explains my thinking on that issue. And we'll be putting out videos on other things too. My mother's recorded one. I've recorded one at some of the city's parks. And we're looking forward to communicating that way as well. I think that there's so many different ways these days to reach people, and we're trying to use traditional means like the mailbox, but also social media and press coverage as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our listeners. We really appreciate you coming out here.
One last thing.
Yes.
I am endorsed by 3 very, very progressive women in this community who have been the backbone of public life for over 50 years. And they are the first woman mayor of Tampa, Sandy Friedman. She was the mayor from 1986 to 1995. The current clerk of the circuit court, Pat Frank, who is a longtime public servant, a school board member, a state senator, a former Hillsborough County commissioner, and also our public defender, Julianne Holt, who has been the public defender of Hillsborough County since 1992 and is also a major figure in this community for equity and social justice.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Again, I really appreciate you coming out here and giving us your time. We wish you the absolute best of luck in your campaign.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. As I said, as he mentioned, if you're interested in getting involved in his campaign, please search him out on social media. All of the candidates could use contributions. They could use your support and definitely your vote as of March 5th, which is the election. Again, thank you so much for listening to Reclaiming My Mind. My name is Jessica Vaughn. You can always contact me with any questions or comments at jvaughn30@gmail.com. And again, thank you so much for listening. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.